So let me, I'm going to go ahead and skip on to the sermon then. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Eric Helen. I'm one of the elders here. Randy is on vacation. Thank you. It's always important to have someone sitting near the front row to tell you how this actually works. If there are any children they would like to go to children's worship, check. Okay. So my name's Eric Helen. I'm one of the elders here. Randy and his family are traveling this week, so he asked me to sort of fill in. This gave me two opportunities. One, to sort of preach the sermon to, but two, to do something I've been wanting to do since I was a small child. My father is a Methodist minister who, when I was a kid, would preach at various churches around central Missouri. We always loved this. This was kind of a chance to sort of get out and explore the countryside, and the Volkswagen van would go bouncing along country roads. But there was always a moment that I found really unnerving as a kid, and that was the moment where he made us sit on the front row and introduce us. And so this is my parents sitting on the front row. This is Alan and Nancy Helland, who are visiting us. So I'm taking this opportunity to sort of pay back your kindness and introduce you while sitting on the front row. Thank you. I don't have my clicker, so I'm just going to signal you to sort of advance unless the clicker's up here and I missed it. So let's go to the next slide. Let me tell you one story. The other nice thing about being a minister is that you end up in sermons from time to time. As all of you know, they end up in my sermons on a fairly regular basis. So I'm going to take this opportunity to tell another story about them. When I was a kid, my dad, for years, worked at a veterans hospital. He was a chaplain there. And he, around the holidays, Thanksgiving and Christmas, he would bring some of the vets who didn't have family that sort of lived at the hospital. He would sort of bring them home, and they would sort of have meals with our family. Now, these were often people, well, let's just say they were kind of odd occasionally. But I would love to say there was some great story here where something funny happened. There was never that. There was just a lot of guys who were very grateful to sort of come and have dinner with the family. So I sort of associate hospitality with the holidays, but kind of in a different way. That is, strangers would just come to dinner at our Christmas and sort of Thanksgiving. And it was, as a kid, it was always, but I didn't know these people. They were strangers. And yet, there was something always very loving about that. They were very, very grateful for the chance to be there. So that is sort of what prompted this sermon. If you don't know this passage, this is one of my favorite. This is in Hebrews. I went ahead and took the version from the King James version just because it's way more poetic. But it says, "Be not forgetful to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares." Now, hold that thought in your head. If you remember where this comes from, it's actually referring to a really weird passage in Genesis where Abraham begins a negotiation with God to try to save Sodom and Gomorrah. And he says if there's this many righteous people, but he's a little concerned, I guess, about how many righteous people there actually are. So he starts working his way down. And then God decides to test this. And he says, all right, he's going to send angels in disguise. But if you remember how he does it, the angels go in disguise as two homeless people. They're just going to spend the night on the streets, and that's going to be a test of whether or not there are any good people in Sodom and Gomorrah. And it doesn't work out so well for Sodom and Gomorrah, but it's interesting to me that God decided that the test was how people in a city responded to strangers, particularly strangers, who, for all that they knew, had no circle of friends. Go to the next slide. Interestingly enough, Jesus is pretty explicit about this. This is from Matthew. In Matthew, there's this parable of the sheep and the goats. And remember how this goes. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. And all the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put on his right hand the sheep, and he will send the goats to the left. When the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you are blessed by my Father. Take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and invited you in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you as a stranger and invite you in, needing clothing and clothe you? When did we see you sick and in prison and come to visit you?" And the king will say, "Truly I say to you, whenever you did this for one of the least of these brothers and sisters, you did it for me." And then he will say to those on his left, "Depart from me, you are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not invite me in. I needed clothes, and you did not clothe me. I was sick and in prison, and you did not look after me." And they also will answer, "Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty, needing clothing, or sick and in prison, and did not help you?" And he will reply, "Truly, I tell you, whenever you did not do it for the least of these, you did not do it for me." And they will go away into eternal punishment, and the righteous into eternal life. So it's interesting that Jesus makes this very explicit. This is what you are supposed to do. This is how you are supposed to be hospitable. I'm reading a book right now called Beauty Saved the World. And don't worry if you don't want to read this. It will show up in sermons later, I promise. But Beauty Saved the World has the idea that the beauty of Christ is what saved us. I love the image, but I got to say, I'm increasingly finding myself not agreeing, because I don't think people found Jesus' love beautiful. I think they found it transgressive. And here's what I mean by that. Look, if we found it beautiful to take care of people, he wouldn't need to tell us this. Transgressive is one of these wonderful SAT words that essentially means it's a behavior outside the boundaries. That is, what Jesus is asking us to do, if this were easy, you wouldn't need that much of the Gospel of Matthew to say, you need to do this. There's something about this that doesn't work for us, and the question I want to examine today is, what is it? Why is this one hard for us, right? What is it about this that we need to be told to take care of strangers? Now, before I do that, I want to ask a maybe more basic question. Who's a stranger? Who is a stranger? So let me give you another story. The story here concerns a woman named Addison. Now, if you remember Addison, Addison was a college student from Abilene Christian. She came here this summer. And Addison was studying engineering, and she was working at a firm somewhere on an internship. And she came and became part of our fellowship. And we did a good job as a church. We really did. We embraced her. We invited her to lunch. We invited her to the praise team. We were very hospitable. And she sent us a letter at the end of the summer that said, you know, I really appreciate what you did for me. And she quoted that passage from Matthew. She said, I was a stranger, and you sort of welcomed me, and I was lonely, and you sort of made me feel welcome. And it was, and we deserve some credit for this. But I want to step back from that for a moment and point out the following. A number of you know this. At exactly the same moment, my daughter, Sophia, was doing an internship in Boston. And I asked a number of you, Connie and I did, to pray for her. We said, you know, it's hard being a 20-year-old in a strange city. And one of the things that can slip, you can be lonely, is finding a spiritual home, finding a church that makes you feel welcome. You're temporarily there. You don't know anyone. This is a part of your life. Sophie grew up in this church. It's been sort of part of her life. And she was moving away from that. And we said, pray for her that she will find someone. So I imagine the following scenario where God is listening to those prayers and says, Eric, that's a great prayer. I want to honor that prayer. That is a really wonderful prayer, that you would pray for a young person in a strange city, that they could find a church that would welcome them and make them feel like they had some spiritual support. Can I introduce you to Addison? It's not hard to see your kid in another 20-year-old raised in the church who walks into your church and says, I'm alone in a strange city, I don't know anyone, and I'd like a place to sort of worship. Every so often, God throws, to use your metaphor, a softball across the plate. Now, a lot of churches, to be fair, miss the softball. But what I want to suggest is Addison wasn't really a stranger in the way Jesus meant it. Addison was like us. In a way, Sophie's like us, right? Being hospitable to people that remind us of kids in our church, we should do that. That's not a bad thing. But we shouldn't stop there because, again, that should be pretty easy for us, right? Jesus doesn't need to take a huge chunk of the Gospel of Matthew to say, be nice to people who remind you of Sophie, Eric. I got that one. I'm okay on that. So the question is, who's a stranger? Who is it? Let me go to the next scripture. This is from my new obsession book of the Bible. For those of you that know me, I kind of get really into sort of one book and I don't get out for years. Currently, it's Ruth. Ruth is a really interesting book, and I'm actually going to I'm teaching the class today, so I'm going to talk more about Ruth. But let me just give you the barest of stories of Ruth. Ruth is a Moabite woman. She's not an Israelite. She goes with her mother-in-law after her husband dies back to Israel, and they're very poor, and she begins basically gathering food. And so the passage picks up there. It says, just then Boaz, who's the owner of the land she's gathering food on, arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. Lord be with you. Bless you, and the Lord bless you, they answered. Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, who does that young woman belong to? And the overseers replied, she is a Moabite who came from Moab with Naomi. She said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves and the harvesters. And she came into the field and remained here from morning until now, except for a short rest in the shelter. So Boaz said to Ruth, daughter, listen to me. Don't go glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the fields where the men are harvesting, and follow along with the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you, and whenever you are thirsty, go get a drink from the water jars that the men have filled. And at this she bowed her face to the ground and said, why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner? So let me propose the first thing about strangers that this passage tells us. We don't notice them. The first thing is, what's Boaz's big triumph in this moment? Boaz's big triumph is that circle of hospitality just got a little bit bigger for a Moabite woman. He doesn't owe her anything under the law, right? But he realizes she's in great danger, right? Don't lay a hand on her is polite Bible language for don't assault this person. Don't go anywhere else. You're not safe, but I'm going to protect you, right? Now, it's a lovely story, but I think the important fact is something happens that Boaz actually notices who she is. So I think the first thing Jesus is telling us is you need to notice people who are outside the circle of hospitality, outside the normal people that you will notice, right? People who are not like you in some way, right? Let me tell another story, partially true, partially made up. So here's my partially true story, or the true story. The true story is Thanksgiving. So this Thanksgiving, we were going down to see Connie's sister down in San Diego, and we took the 15, and we're driving down the 15. And as we're driving down the 15, somewhere about Temecula, Connie goes, oh, we're in trouble. And if you remember Thanksgiving, it's pouring rain. There's lots of sort of accidents. And what's happened is we have suddenly encountered a 4-hour delay. So we're all in the car. It's Connie, Madeline, and I, and we're trying to figure out what to do next. And Connie says, well, maybe if we took these roads, Google's sending us off on the canyon roads in Temecula, and it looks like it'll save us like 3 hours. So we immediately pull off, not really thinking through that, in fact, everyone else on the 15 was doing the same thing. And so for 4 hours, we're stuck in the canyon roads. We pop out 1.5 miles south of Temecula, and there's another 4-hour delay, at which point we called Connie's sister and said, we're just not making it. We can't get there. We've been in the car 7 hours. We turned around, drove home. On the way there, we stopped and had Thanksgiving in a McDonald's. And we had a great time. We really did. It was a lot of fun. Madeline's playlist is surprisingly good for someone who's 20 years old. I was in the car with wonderful people. We had great conversation. Now, if you take Matthew literally, right, we knew that the circle of hospitality extended to the three of us. You could tell another version of the story where we all get mad at each other and it's a really unpleasant 7 hours of, sort of recriminations. But it worked out, and Connie is like nodding. It worked out nicely. We were all friendly to each other. This is the problem with having your family sitting on the front row, is you can all watch and see if the stories are actually true. So my point is, the circle of hospitality extended. Now let me give another story. This one is made up. Imagine we had decided to go back and see my parents in Missouri. So we get on a plane, and that snowstorm that blankets the country, we are trapped in the Denver airport. Because, of course, this being Southwest, we would fly that far and we would get stuck. And so I'm sitting in the pet relief area because it's the only spot I can find an open piece of carpet, and I've got my phone plugged into the wall, and the emotional support ferrets are running wild. And I'm miserable. And I can't even have the McDonald's Thanksgiving dinner because there's 50,000 people lined up in front of the McDonald's in Denver, and it ran out of milkshakes about 5 hours ago. And I am really, really unhappy. And then all of a sudden, over the loudspeaker, it says, the flight to St. Louis is canceled. And so in this hypothetical scenario, I make my way up to the ticket counter, and I encounter, and let's make her up, Becky. And Becky is the unfortunate Southwest ticket agent who just decided maybe she would make a little extra money by working Thanksgiving, which is not supposed to be a busy day, and now there are 10 million angry people stuck in Denver facing Becky. Now, if you believe Matthew, I face a spiritual choice right here, right now. Version 1 is I can say, Becky, I am so sorry that you're stuck here like me. I know you don't want to be here. Would you please try to help me get home? And if you can't, right, I understand, because you don't make the weather. You don't fly the planes. You don't service planes. All you're trying to do is figure out how to get me home. But look, what's going to happen? I'm going to unload on Becky because I'm angry and I'm frustrated, and she is wearing a Southwest uniform. And poor Becky is going to deal with my sort of anger and frustration because I'm not going to extend that circle of hospitality to her because I'm angry, frustrated, and not noticing. Now, if you take Matthew literally, imagine the end of my life. I come walking up sort of to heaven, and there, standing at the gate, is Becky. And Becky looks at me and says, "Hi, Eric, do you remember me?" And I say, "No, Becky, I have no idea who you are." And she says, "Oh, I was back in 2019. I was the ticket agent you were mean to." "Oh, I'm sorry, Becky." "Well, that's okay, Eric. I have bad news and I have good news. The good news, Eric, or the bad news, Eric, is I'm Jesus. But the good news is I finally got you a flight out of Denver. It's over here to the left, and it goes to Goat City." Okay, now I'm making that up. Obviously, for hyperbole and effect. But my point is, in those moments of anger and frustration, it is very hard for us to extend that circle of hospitality to people we perceive of as strangers. We're sort of not hardwired that way. That's why Jesus is saying to us. So what do we do? What is the option? And so let me give you kind of to one possible way. And to that, I want to sort of introduce sort of one more character, and that is a nun from the turn of the last century named Sister Teresa. Interestingly, Sister Teresa was the nun that Mother Teresa took her name from. And Sister Teresa basically studied. She was apparently something of a scholar, but she said the problem for her was that spiritual discipline never seemed to result from learning something new. Or to put another way, the last thing everybody needs is another sermon on the Good Samaritan. We know we're supposed to be hospitable. You knew it when you came in. I've reminded you, but you kind of knew that. So the question for her was, why do I intellectually know that I should pray, but I don't pray? Why do I know that I should be hospitable, and yet at various points I find myself reacting badly to the stranger in ways that that God has told me explicitly not to do. And Sister Teresa's response was, we need to take opportunities to be intentional in our devotions. That is, make a time every day when you're going to pray, or you will forget to pray. And make a time that you will be hospitable, that you will be sure that you are going to put yourself in a situation where you are around strangers and you need to be hospitable. I want to pause before I finish up and tell just one more story, because that's how I roll. And that is, or maybe not a story, I just want to do something you don't get a chance to do very often as a child. And that is to say in front of a group of people how much I appreciate my parents while they're sitting there. So I had a wonderful childhood. You were and are fantastic parents, and I'm just going to embarrass you in front of a lot of people and say that. One of the ways you were fantastic parents, though, was that you were Christians and are Christians. And I don't just mean that in the sense that you took us to church, because that's kind of a prerequisite if you're a minister, I think. But I think the thing that I look back on is you lived the life of Christians in the sort of the way you acted. And one of those ways was you put us in the path of strangers. And if I take this literally, you introduced us to angels, and maybe for a brief moment, we met Jesus. And I cannot tell you how grateful I am for that, because it means in some sense that strangers were not, that you showed who mattered in the kingdom by who you invited into your home. Okay, so I'll stop embarrassing my parents and go back to then something Marty said at the beginning of announcements. So here's my request for all of you. The first is, on January 19th, a group of us are going to go to be with these unaccompanied refugee children and just have a day playing, games, sports, whatever. So my request from you is not that you go, although it would be lovely to have you if you want to go through the training. I want you to pray for us, because I want to tell you who some of these children are. Some of these children are Rohingya. That is, and if you don't know who those people are, Burma or Myanmar, depending on what name you want to use for the country, is a country in South Asia. On the western edge of that, Burma is primarily Buddhist, is a Muslim minority called the Rohingya. With the transition to democracy several years ago, the military in Burma decided to basically ethnically cleanse the western part of the country. And they drove most of the Muslim population out of that area. And they did that by basically killing the men, raping the women, and driving anybody they could sort of out of the country and into Bangladesh, one of the poorest places on earth. And so a very small number of children have ended up refugees here. Now, that's not all of the children we meet, but it's a few of them. And if those people are not strangers, I don't know who is. They are very, very much unlike us. I hope none of us ever experience what some of these kids have gone through, but it's hard for us to sort of even fathom what that means. So my prayer for you is, or my request from you is to pray for those of us that are going. Because to be perfectly honest, part of the reason that we like this sort of the circle of hospitality is that that's where we're comfortable. And I have a feeling that this may not be comfortable, in the sense that I think this might be hard. So pray for us that we remember that we're entertaining angels, and maybe we're going to see the face of Jesus. So that's my request from you. Thank you, and I appreciate this. Thanks.